was a night that seemed endless. The kind where the silence outside your window feels too heavy, almost alive, pressing against the glass as though it's listening to you breathe. In a forgotten coastal town where the sea never rested, where waves beat against the rocks like drums of war, Elias lived a life of shadows. His days were marked by routine, by the dull repetition of work in the old library, where dust floated in shafts of dim light and ancient books whispered stories no one cared to read anymore. But his nights, those belonged to something else entirely, something darker, something he could neither escape nor explain. He would wake at odd hours, drenched in sweat, hearing whispers that weren't his own, feeling cold hands on his skin, though no one was there. The town itself seemed to conspire against him. Doors creaked when no wind blew. Alleys seemed to stretch longer when he walked through them, and the sea sang to him in a language that was not meant for human ears. Elias carried all this in silence until the day he met Maren. Maren was unlike anyone the town had ever seen. She had arrived suddenly, a stranger with eyes like storm clouds and a voice that could hush even the waves. Rumors spread fast, as they always did in small towns. Some said she was a widow running from her past. Others claimed she was a witch. Elias didn't care. From the moment he saw her standing at the edge of the pier, staring into the abyss where the sea swallowed the horizon, he knew she was bound to him somehow. She smiled at him once, just once, but it was enough to plant the seed of obsession. He began to follow her, quietly, carefully, always at a distance. He told himself it was curiosity, but in truth it was hunger, the kind that gnaws at your bones until you can no longer resist. Nights grew longer, and the whispers that plagued him now began to chant her name. At first, their meetings were accidental, or at least that's what he pretended. He would appear at the marketplace when she was there, or walk the same path home under the excuse of taking in the night air. She never pushed him away, nor did she invite him closer. Her silence was both permission and torment. One evening, rain lashed against the cobblestones as Elias found himself outside her house. The candlelight flickered through her window, shadows dancing across the curtains. He swore he saw another figure inside, someone standing too close to her, whispering into her ear. Rage and fear surged inside him. He stood there for hours, drenched, trembling, until the light went out and he was left alone with the storm. The next morning, the whispers in his head were louder, sharper. They told him that she wasn't safe, that someone was trying to take her away. They told him it was his duty to protect her. They told him the town itself wanted her blood. Elias could no longer tell if these voices were madness or truth, but he believed them all the same. His obsession twisted into devotion, and devotion into something far more dangerous. He began writing her letters he never delivered, pages filled with confessions and promises, stained with his tears. He carved her name into the walls of his room until his fingers bled. The sea roared outside as though it approved, as though it demanded he go further. Then came the night everything changed. Elias woke from another nightmare, gasping for breath, and saw Maren standing in his room. Or at least, he thought it was her. Her dress clung to her like it was soaked, her hair dripping seawater onto his floor. She didn't speak, but her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. When he reached for her, she vanished, leaving only the scent of salt and the damp imprint of her feet. He ran to the pier the next day, desperate, and there she was, real, solid, alive. When their eyes met, she didn't seem surprised to see him. Instead, she whispered softly, "You've heard them too, haven't you?" That was the moment Elias realized his torment wasn't his alone. From then on, they were bound. Nights turned into rituals where they would sit by the sea, listening to its forbidden language, trying to make sense of the words that clawed at their minds. Maren confessed that ever since arriving in the town, she had felt watched, touched, as though the ocean itself claimed her. Elias told her of the whispers, of the visions, of the figure he saw in her house. Together they sank deeper into the madness, convincing themselves that they weren't cursed, but chosen. The town became a blur to them. Friends, neighbors, Even family ceased to matter. Only the sea and the voices within it were real. Only their bond mattered. But obsession never stays pure. It rots, it festers, it consumes. Elias began to notice the way Marin sometimes drifted away mid-conversation, her eyes unfocused, lips murmuring words he couldn't understand. He caught her sneaking away at night, standing knee-deep in the freezing surf, her arms spread wide as though embracing something invisible. When he tried to pull her back, she fought him, her strength unnatural, her voice not her own. He was terrified, but even more than that, he was terrified of losing her. He convinced himself that whatever force had claimed them both could be tamed, if only they surrendered fully. He held her as she wept, kissed her salt-stained lips, and whispered promises he couldn't keep. The line between love and possession blurred until there was nothing left of the man he once was. The sea's call grew stronger with every passing night, and Elias began to fear sleep itself. His dreams were no longer his own. They belonged to the voices that slipped through the cracks of his mind like water through stone. He saw visions of drowned cities, of people with hollow eyes walking into the waves without struggle, of dark figures watching from beneath the surface. Each time he woke, Marin was there in his thoughts, tangled inseparably with the horrors. It was as though she was both his salvation and his damnation. Marin, too, was changing. Her once pale skin now carried a strange sheen, as though touched permanently by the sea. Her hair seemed darker, heavier, and when the moonlight struck her face, Elias sometimes swore he could see faint scales glittering along her jaw. She laughed less, spoke less, and when she did, her words carried strange rhythms that didn't belong to human speech. At first Elias told himself it was his imagination, but denial quickly became impossible. Whatever was happening to her, it was real, and it was spreading. One evening, as they sat on the pier, Elias gathered the courage to ask, "What are we becoming?" Marin looked at him for a long time, her storm-gray eyes reflecting the restless sea, not becoming. She whispered, remembering the word chilled him, remembering what she leaned close, her breath warm against his ear, who we were before this town forgot. Before the land stole us from the ocean, Elias felt his stomach twist. He wanted to reject her words, to tell her she was wrong, but deep inside, he knew she spoke the truth his mind had fought to bury. The dreams, the voices, the visions, they weren't madness. They were memories, and that realization was far more terrifying than insanity. The next days blurred into a fever. Elias stopped going to the library. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped speaking to anyone but Marin. The townsfolk began to whisper about him the way they had whispered about her. He's cursed. He's drowning from the inside. He's marked. None dared approach him, not even out of pity. The isolation suited him, because only in Marin's presence did the chaos make sense. Only with her did the whispers sound like songs instead of screams. But the figure in Marin's house haunted him still. On stormy nights, when thunder shook the windows, Elias swore he saw the shadow again, tall, faceless, always standing just behind her. Once he tried to confront it, bursting into her home uninvited. The air inside was thick with salt, the floor damp as though the sea had seeped in. Marin sat by the fire, her eyes half closed, lips murmuring in that alien language, and there it was, the figure, looming just behind her chair. Elias shouted, demanded it show itself, but Marin only looked at him with a mix of pity and anger. "There is no figure," she said softly, "only what you refuse to accept." But Elias knew what he had seen. He left that night shaken, but not defeated. If Marin was drifting too far, if something else had its grip on her, then he would pull her back. He would fight for her, no matter how deep into the abyss he had to go. Love, obsession, madness, Whatever name it bore, it was stronger than fear. The sea seemed to sense his resolve. The waves grew higher, the nights darker, the voices louder. They mocked him, taunted him, begged him. He began to notice strange symbols carved into the rocks along the shore, spirals and runes that glowed faintly under moonlight. Sometimes Maren traced them with her fingers, her face slack with reverence. Elias tried to copy them in his journal, but each time he finished a symbol, the ink would smear, the page would curl, and the letters would dissolve into black stains. Then one night, Maren came to him drenched and shivering. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "It's time," she whispered. "They're waiting." Elias's pulse thundered in his ears. "Who's waiting?" She took his hand, her grip cold as ice. "Our family," he followed her, because he had no choice. Down to the beach they went, where the tide had pulled back unnaturally far, revealing jagged stones, slick with seaweed. The air smelled of rot and iron. At the edge of the exposed shore, figures stood in the mist, dozens of them, motionless, their faces hidden. Elias's legs trembled, but Maren held him fast. "They've come for us," she said, her voice both fearful and reverent. As the figures stepped forward, Elias saw their faces, or rather, what was left of them. Their skin was pale and swollen, their mouths stretched too wide, their eyes dark voids filled with the sea's hunger. Yet despite their horror, Elias felt a pang of recognition. He knew them, not as strangers, but as kin. The tide roared, rushing back with impossible force, and the figures sank into the waves one by one, vanishing beneath the black water. Maren stepped forward, pulling Elias with her. "We have to go," she urged. But Elias froze. His heart screamed to follow, but his mind clung to the remnants of his humanity. "If we go," he whispered, "we don't come back." Maren turned to him, her storm-gray eyes shining with tears. "We were never meant to come back." Elias staggered backward, his chest heaving as though the very air was drowning him. The sound of the tide crashing against the rocks thundered in his skull. But louder still was Maren's voice, soft and insistent, pulling him toward the abyss. "You feel it too," she whispered, stepping closer, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks. "The pull, the belonging. You've felt it your whole life and called it emptiness. Don't lie to yourself now." Her words struck too true. Elias had always felt different, disconnected from the town, from people, from the fragile normalcy others seemed to cling to. Books, knowledge, rituals. None of it had filled the void inside him. Only Maren had, and through her, the sea. But still, fear gnawed at him. "If I go with you, what happens to me? What happens to us?" Maren's lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. "We don't lose ourselves. We remember. We wake up." The figures in the mist had vanished, but their absence felt heavier than their presence. Elias could still feel their eyes, hollow and hungry, watching from beneath the waves. The thought of joining them made bile rise in his throat. But the thought of losing Maren was worse. When he didn't move, she pressed her forehead against his Elias. "If you stay, you will wither. The land will bleed you dry. You'll spend your life haunted, half awake, never whole. But if you come with me, you'll never be alone again." The promise in her voice was both salvation and curse. He could almost taste the salt on her lips, feel the ocean already rising in his veins. His hands trembled as he cupped her face. "I'm afraid," he confessed. Her storm-gray eyes softened, though the hunger within them never dimmed. "So am I. But we were born afraid." Then, without another word, she turned and walked into the waves. Elias's breath caught. For a moment he thought she would stop at her waist, maybe her chest, but she didn't. She kept walking, the water swallowing her inch by inch, until it closed over her head. The moonlight shimmered on the ripples where she had disappeared. He waited. A minute. 2. His heart pounded so violently he thought it might burst. Then, from beneath the water, her face surfaced again. Changed. Her eyes glowed faintly, her skin pale as bone, her hair streaming like black seaweed. She raised a hand to him, silent but beckoning. Elias's body moved before his mind decided. Step by step he waded into the icy water, each wave pulling at him like a hand, dragging him further in. The cold bit into his flesh, but with every step something else warmed, a strange, thrumming energy, as though the ocean itself was alive inside him. By the time the water reached his chest, his fear was gone. Only hunger remained. Hunger for truth. Hunger for Maren. Hunger for the endless dark. He reached her, their fingers tangling beneath the water. Her grip was no longer fragile. It was iron. She pulled him deeper, her face close to his. Breathe. She whispered. Elias shook his head violently. I can't. But before he could finish, she pressed her lips to his, and in that kiss, salt flooded his lungs. He gagged, coughed, struggled, but she held him tighter, her voice echoing inside his mind rather than his ears. Breathe. And when he did, when the water poured in, it didn't kill him, it filled him, it remade him. His vision blurred, then sharpened beyond anything he had known. He saw the abyss not as void, but as home. He saw shapes moving in the black water, vast and monstrous, but they no longer terrified him. They welcomed him. Maren smiled against his lips. Together they sank. The deeper they went, the louder the voices became, until they weren't voices at all, but a chorus, singing, screaming, praying. Elias felt his humanity tear away piece by piece, but in its place came something older, stronger, infinite. When at last they reached the bottom, Elias opened his eyes wide, and in the darkness he saw not death but a kingdom. And there, waiting on a throne of coral and bone, was the figure he had always feared. Faceless, towering, its arms spread in welcome. The same figure that had always stood behind Maren, the same figure that had always stood behind him. Elias stood frozen before the throne, his body trembling, though the ocean itself seemed to hold him upright. The faceless figure leaned forward, vast and eternal, its presence so heavy it crushed every thought from his mind. Yet at the same time, it felt familiar, like a shadow that had followed him since birth. Maren knelt at the creature's feet, her voice trembling in worship. He is ready. The faceless king extended one enormous hand, and Elias felt something stir deep in his chest, as if invisible strings bound his heart to that abyssal god. Memories flashed. His mother whispering lullabies of the sea, the strange marks on his skin he'd always hidden, the nights he'd woken choking on salt water in his sleep. None of it had been coincidence. None of it had been madness. It had always been this. You were never theirs. The voice boomed, not through the water, not through sound, but inside his bones. You were mine. You always were. Elias gasped, clutching his chest as the truth tore through him. He wasn't simply human. He wasn't simply chosen. He was born of the sea, a vessel waiting to be filled, a child of the abyss disguised in fragile flesh. Maren rose, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her eyes shone with pride, but also sorrow. Now you understand. I brought you here because without you the cycle cannot continue. You are not just my love, Elias. You are the heir. The throne's shadow loomed larger, wrapping around him like a cloak. Elias wanted to scream, to deny it, but the hunger inside him had already decided. He could feel his veins glowing, his skin hardening, his lungs no longer human but built for the black waters. The creature's power seeped into him, rewriting every thread of who he was. Elias, Maren whispered, her hand trembling against his cheek. "Don't forget me when you ascend." He looked at her, really looked, and saw the desperation behind her devotion. She had given everything to bring him here, yet in the end, she would remain a servant while he rose as something far greater. A part of him wanted to promise he would never leave her. Another part, the part already claimed by the abyss, knew that promise would be a lie. The faceless king touched his brow, and Elias's vision went white. He felt the ocean split, the tides bending to his will, the voices of the drowned rising in his mind like an army. He was no longer Elias. He was something beyond name, beyond man, beyond mercy. When the light dimmed, he sat upon the throne. Maren stood before him, head bowed, tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of awe. Around them, the abyssal kingdom stirred, shapes twisting and bowing, acknowledging their new ruler. Elias opened his mouth, and the sea itself trembled at his voice. "I see now. The land was never my home. Humanity was never my cage. I am the storm that drowns their shores. I am the silence in their lungs. I am what they fear in the dark." Maren lifted her face, her smile broken but radiant. "Then it's done. The world above will never be the same." For a moment, Elias almost reached for her hand, but instead he raised his arm, commanding the tides. Far above, on the surface, the sea roared to life, waves towering higher than mountains, ready to swallow the town that had always mocked and rejected him. As the screams of the living echoed faintly from above, Elias closed his eyes. And in the crushing dark of the deep, with Maren at his side and an ancient crown upon his head, he finally felt whole. Not human, not lost, but king, the king of the drowned.